The night was thick with silence, save for the rhythmic chirping of crickets. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood in front of my neighbor's house, staring at the slightly ajar door. The porch light flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows over the neglected garden. Something was wrong. Mr. Holden was not the type to leave his house unsecured. He was meticulous, almost to the point of paranoia, always ensuring every window was locked and the front door bolted. But now his door hung open, like an invitation to something sinister. I hesitated, my mind racing with conflicting thoughts. Should I call the police? Knock? Step inside? A rustling sound from behind made me whirl around. Across the street, Carla, our neighborhood's self-proclaimed enforcer of Homeowner Association rules, stood with her arms crossed, watching me like a hawk. Her blonde bob framed her sharp, unimpressed expression, and her lips twisted into something resembling a smirk. "You shouldn't be snooping, Dan," she said, her voice sickly sweet yet laced with venom. "Mr. Holden moved out. Nothing for you to see." "Moved out?" I echoed, my eyes narrowing. "He never mentioned he was leaving. He's lived here for 15 years. Just last week he told me he was finishing up his garden work for spring." Carla shrugged, feigning disinterest. "People change their minds. HOA facilitated everything. It's best to let it go." She turned on her heel, heading back toward her house, the porch light illuminating her retreating figure. Something about her demeanor didn't sit right with me. Mr. Holden wasn't just a passing acquaintance. He was a friend, and he wouldn't have left without a word. I stepped closer to the door and pushed it open. The hinges groaned, revealing the dimly lit interior. Everything was exactly as he'd left it. Newspapers stacked on the coffee table, his reading glasses beside them. A half-empty cup of tea sat on the counter, the liquid inside long since turned cold. The faint scent of his cologne still lingered in the air, mixing with the musty odor of an undisturbed home. No one had packed. No moving boxes. No signs of departure. My gut twisted. Something wasn't right. I walked through the living room, running my fingers over the dust-free surfaces. Mr. Holden was methodical, almost obsessive about keeping his home clean. Yet there were no notes, no mail piled up. If he had planned to leave, there would be evidence. Some sign that he had willingly packed up his life, but there was nothing. I reached for his answering machine. The small screen blinked with 3 unheard messages. My breath hitched. I hesitated before pressing play. The first message crackled to life. "Mr. Holden, this is a courtesy reminder from the Homeowner Association regarding your upcoming property review. Please be sure to comply with all standards. Failure to do so may result in consequences." The second message followed. "Mr. Holden, we have received reports of disturbances from your residents. We strongly advise you to adhere to HOA guidelines." The third message was different. A deep, distorted voice spoke in hushed urgency. "You shouldn't have looked, Holden. You shouldn't have asked questions. This is your last warning." A chill ran down my spine. I turned sharply, my eyes scanning the darkened corners of the house as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. My instincts screamed at me to get out, but I needed answers. I walked toward the back of the house, checking each room. His bedroom was untouched, bed made neatly, but the closet door was ajar. I pulled it open, expecting to see neatly hung clothes, but my stomach lurched. Inside were only a few garments, the rest gone. Yet his shoes remained, lined up perfectly along the floor. Who leaves their home and forgets to take their shoes? In the bathroom, his toothbrush was still in the holder. His razor and shaving cream sat untouched on the sink. It made no sense. If he had truly moved, why would he leave behind things people use daily? A sudden sound made me freeze. A creak, soft but distinct. It came from the hallway. My breath caught as I stepped lightly toward the door, peering out. The house was still, yet an unshakable feeling of being watched sent prickles down my spine. I turned the hallway corner. Nothing. But then my eyes landed on something strange. On the floor near the entrance was a single slip of paper. It looked like it had been hastily torn from a notebook. I bent down and picked it up. There was only one thing written on it, scrawled in shaky handwriting. "Help me." My pulse pounded in my ears. This wasn't just paranoia. Something had happened to Mr. Holden, and he had left this behind as a desperate message. Footsteps echoed from outside. I quickly shut the answering machine off and stepped toward the front door, just in time to see a sleek black SUV rolling down the street. It paused in front of Mr. Holden's house. A man in a dark suit peered at me from the passenger seat before whispering something to the driver. The SUV lingered for a few seconds before speeding off. The hairs on my arms stood on end. I wasn't imagining things. Mr. Holden hadn't left willingly, and someone didn't want me asking questions. And now I had a sinking feeling that I had just become their next problem. The unease that had settled in my stomach the night before didn't fade by morning. Instead, it festered, growing into something more insidious. I barely slept, replaying the scene over and over in my mind. The open door, the eerie silence, the untouched belongings, and most of all, the note with 2 words scrawled in panic, "Help me." By sunrise, I had already made my decision. I wasn't letting this go. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number of someone who might be able to help. Mark Evans. Mark was an old friend, a former journalist who had spent years uncovering corruption and scandals. If anyone could help me dig into this, it was him. I called, and after a few rings, his groggy voice answered, "Dan, it's not even 7. What's wrong?" "I need your help," I said, keeping my voice low as I glanced out the window. "My neighbor is missing. The HOA is acting suspicious, and I think something's seriously wrong." There was a pause. Then, "Give me 20 minutes. The tension in my chest hadn't eased since I received that anonymous text. If anything, it had only gotten worse. Mark and I spent the next few hours combing through everything we could find on the Homeowner Association. We uncovered old lawsuits, financial discrepancies, and multiple reports of harassment from past homeowners who had mysteriously disappeared or relocated under pressure. "This isn't just a case of an overreaching HOA," Mark muttered, his fingers rapidly tapping against his laptop's keyboard. "This is a racket. They push people out, claim their homes, and resell them. It's organized fraud." I exhaled sharply, and Holden was their next target. Mark nodded grimly. If he didn't cooperate, they made him disappear. A knot tightened in my stomach. "Then we need proof." That night, I decided to go back to Holden's house. If the HOA had something to hide, they might have left a clue. I pulled on a dark hoodie and waited until the neighborhood was mostly asleep before making my way down the street. As I approached, I saw that the black SUV was gone, but the unease lingered. I slipped around to the back of the house where I had noticed the new lock earlier. I crouched down, examining the door. The lock was sturdy but not unbeatable. Glancing over my shoulder to make sure no one was watching, I pulled a small screwdriver from my pocket and got to work. It took a few minutes, but eventually the lock gave way with a quiet click. I eased the door open and stepped inside. The house smelled stale, like dust and abandonment. I flicked on my phone's flashlight and moved cautiously through the kitchen. Everything was as it had been before. Holden's teacup still on the counter, newspapers neatly stacked. But something felt off. I stepped into the hallway and noticed it immediately. A faint outline in the carpet leading toward the basement door. My heart pounded as I followed the marks. The basement door was slightly ajar, as if someone had been in a hurry. Swallowing hard, I pushed it open the rest of the way and descended the stairs, my flashlight casting long, eerie shadows. The basement was cold and the air felt thick, almost suffocating. My light swept across the room and then I saw it. A chair knocked over. Ropes cut and discarded on the ground. Scratches along the floorboards as if someone had struggled. And near the far wall, a phone, Holden's phone, smashed to pieces. I barely had time to register it before I heard a noise upstairs. Footsteps. Someone was here. I killed the flashlight and pressed myself against the basement wall, holding my breath. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. Then a voice I recognized all too well. "Dan, you're making a mistake." Carla. I felt a wave of nausea. Of course, she was involved. The footsteps stopped just outside the basement door. I could hear her breathing, steady and controlled. Then she spoke again, almost kindly. "You should leave, Dan. This isn't your fight." I clenched my jaw. Like hell it wasn't. I heard her take a step back, and for a brief moment, I thought she might be leaving. Then the unmistakable sound of a lock clicking into place. She had locked me in. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I pulled out my phone to call Mark, but there was no signal. Of course, the basement walls were thick, and if the HOA had planned this, they had likely ensured no one could make calls from down here. I turned back to Holden's smashed phone. Maybe, just maybe, I could salvage something from it. I crouched down, carefully collecting the broken device. The screen was shattered, but the memory card might still be intact. If I could find a way out, I could get it to Mark. The problem was I had to find a way out. I turned my flashlight back on and scanned the basement, looking for anything that could help me escape. That's when I noticed it, a small rectangular vent near the ceiling. It would be a tight fit, but I had no other choice. I stacked a few old crates beneath it and hoisted myself up, shoving at the metal grate until it finally gave way. I pulled myself inside, crawling forward, my heart hammering as I heard Carla's footsteps retreating upstairs. I didn't know where this vent led, but I knew one thing. I wasn't stopping until I found Holden and exposed everything the HOA was trying to hide. His jaw tightened. Then we better find out what they're hiding, fast. The narrow vent pressed against my ribs as I dragged myself forward, inhaling the stale, metallic air. My pulse hammered in my ears, drowning out the faint sounds of Carla's retreating footsteps above. I had no idea where this vent led, but I knew one thing. Staying in that basement wasn't an option. I pushed ahead, every movement careful and controlled. The last thing I needed was to make noise. The vent creaked under my weight, and I held my breath, waiting to see if anyone had heard. Silence. I exhaled and kept moving until I saw a faint sliver of light ahead. The vent ended in a small grate leading outside. With shaky fingers, I braced myself and pressed against the metal slats. At first, they didn't budge. I tried again, this time using my shoulder. The grate groaned but didn't give way. Panic gripped me. I couldn't be trapped here. I forced myself to take a slow breath. Think. I adjusted my position and kicked. Hard. The rusted screws snapped, and the grate tumbled onto the grass outside. I wiggled my way out, collapsing onto the damp earth. The cold air hit my face, and for a second, I just lay there, breathing. Then I heard voices, coming from the front of the house. I scrambled up and crouched low behind a row of bushes. From my hiding spot, I could see Carla talking to two men in suits. One of them the same guy from the black SUV. The other, an older man with silver hair, radiated authority. "We've handled it," Carla was saying. "He won't be a problem anymore." The older man didn't look convinced. "Are you sure? Because if this spirals, it's your mess to clean up." Carla hesitated. "He's locked in the basement. He won't—" "I'm not in the basement anymore," I called out, stepping from the shadows. Carla spun around, her eyes going wide. The two men immediately tensed. The older man's face twisted with irritation. "You should have minded your own business, son." I smirked. "Yeah, I get that a lot." Mark had been right. This wasn't just about HOA overreach. This was organized fraud, intimidation, and possibly worse. And now I had something they didn't know about. I pulled Holden's broken phone from my pocket and held it up. "He recorded something, didn't he? That's why you got rid of him, because he found out what you were doing." The older man's expression darkened. "Give me the phone." I took a slow step back. "How about no?" He nodded to the man in the SUV. "Take it from him." The guy moved fast, reaching for something under his jacket. My instincts screamed at me to move. I turned and bolted, dodging between the houses. Footsteps thundered behind me. I needed an escape, fast. I ran toward the only place I knew I could find backup, Mark's place. By the time I reached Mark's apartment, my lungs burned. I pounded on the door. "Open up!" The door swung open and Mark's eyes widened. "What the hell happened?" I shoved the phone into his hands. "Fix it now." Mark pulled me inside and slammed the door shut. "Jesus, Dan, you look like you ran a marathon." "Not far from the truth," I muttered, still catching my breath. Mark sat at his desk, plugging Holden's phone into a recovery device. He glanced at me. "If this thing has anything incriminating, they won't stop coming for you." "Yeah," I said, "I kind of figured." A tense silence filled the room as the recovery software worked. The screen flickered, and then, bingo, a video file popped up. Mark clicked it, and Holden's face appeared, his expression grim. "If you're watching this," he began, "then something happened to me." My stomach clenched. The recording was shaky, like he had been filming in a hurry. The Homeowner Association isn't what it seems. They're forcing people out, forging documents, and reselling properties under fake names. I found proof, contracts, financial transfers. I tried to go to the police, but they're in on it too. Mark turned to me. "Holy—" Holden continued. "They'll come for me soon, but I won't go quietly." The video ended abruptly. Mark looked at me. "This is enough to blow the whole thing open." I nodded. "Yeah, but we need to be smart." The next 24 hours were chaos. Mark leaked the video online, sending copies to every news outlet and watchdog organization he could find. The story exploded. By morning, federal investigators were at the HOA's office. The suits who had chased me, arrested. Carla, nowhere to be found. And Holden, he was alive. He had been held in a storage unit on the edge of town, bound and barely conscious when the authorities found him. When I saw him in the hospital, he gave me a weak smile. "Told you I wasn't moving," he rasped. I chuckled. "Yeah, well, maybe next time. Warn me before you take on a corrupt organization." Holden laughed, then winced. "I owe you, Dan." I shook my head. "No, we took them down together." And as I walked out of that hospital, breathing in the fresh morning air, I knew one thing for sure. The HOA would never mess with this neighborhood again.